Welcome back to week 7. We are in Budapest, Hungary. And are you hungry for more information? We have our top 4 women going into hometowns next week. But in this video, I'm calling it a breakdown of the breakups. But here's another observation I've made, and I'm putting this all together. At this point, has a single woman, especially in the top 4, told Zach that she's falling in love? I don't think so, at least not to him. And with less drama on the women, there's been more focus on Zach. But join me for this important conversation where I want to give you a different way of thinking about Zach. Welcome to Reality TV Therapy with me, Dr. Diane. Welcome back. We made it to hometowns. 4 women left. Which hometowns is always my favorite episode. Why? Well, because as a psychologist, I love seeing families. Let's get into it to find out how everyone became the person they are. And I want to see more of Zach's family too. But first, I want to talk briefly about what happened in week 7 and then dive in a little bit deeper. Okay, we're in Budapest, Hungary. We have 2 one-on-ones, Kaity, Brooklyn, and a group date. First up is Kaity. It's her second one-on-one. And I loved so much about this. I also loved their hooju, the hug jump. The way that Zach kind of bent down and sort of helped Kaity, to me, just says she's definitely the front runner. I really like their energy together. And that old-fashioned typewriter scene was super cute. Check out my husband's version of that.
Kate, how do you spell it again? Katie, roses are red, violets are blue. I'm in Hungary, hungry for you.
Next up, we have Greer. The whole situation, quite frankly, I thought, the poor thing. Did she have to quarantine in Estonia and then they fly her in to Budapest? But to be honest, Zach is coming under so much attack, and I thought he actually handled this breakup pretty well. What did you think? Let me know in the comments. Because he was actually more frank with Greer than he has been with some of the other women, like Jess last week. Not so clear. But he says to Greer, listen, we both got robbed time because we had COVID. And isn't that the truth? And then he says, I couldn't bring you to hometowns because you just haven't had those chances. And it feels like it makes good sense. It is true. We have seen the other relationships progressing, but Zach seems to be more composed, the way that he handles it, speaking about both of us having been robbed. I liked that it felt like a more equal kind of breakup. And Greer handles herself well. The feedback, sure, she would have wanted a chance, but come on, she also knew that other people were advancing. And she's got this whispering. I wondered if that wasn't a post-COVID symptom, but she leaves and there isn't a lot of anger or upset. I thought, okay, good job. All right, now next we go into that group date. One of the worst, next to the psychologist in Vienna that we saw with Klein. They set it up to be dramatic, right? The lights and the woo. And I'm like, okay, and who is this guy? His name is Labib. It turns out he's from New York. He's not even a Houdini guy from Budapest where everything is so... the mentalist skills. So that was kind of silly. And it's not too hard to figure out that the producers had a heavy hand on this one, right? They are feeding the mentalist words that the women have already described. Gabby is, being told that she confuses people. Does she really? I don't know. But she's getting anxious because she's hearing about that. Poor Charity is being fed back to her. The producers knew that she had an episode of infidelity. And Kat is also anxious and crying, but we already knew because Zach himself forewarned Kat that he thought that something weird had happened with the witch thing. So it wasn't that big a leap for then the mentalist to say, well, I know what you're thinking. And for him to say, oh, Kat, you probably wanted to leave. Because she told one of the producers, I'm sure. But I felt like this was, yes, a manipulation. And then all the women ended up feeling worse about themselves. So to me, this wasn't like, oh, good, they felt vulnerable and they felt closer to him. They all felt now super sensitive. But let's point out something that did happen, which went without a lot of notice, was Gabby. Gabby mentions that she has ADHD. She's neurodivergent. And it wasn't a big thing. She says, this is why I'm kind of scattered. I wonder how Zach's going to be about that. But I liked that we are talking openly about these things, because the last time that came up, again, on with Elizabeth and Clayton season, that was like a kind of a big taboo topic. And I actually broke it down on my page and had a specialist in ADHD come on my page. But fascinating. I liked that we're able to speak to that. Now, here's what bugged me. We never got anything vulnerable from Zach. Like, it should be that if you're disclosing, I'm disclosing. Like, that would feel more equal. In fact, on my post on Instagram, I said, okay, Zach, 3 words to describe your date with Rachel in the fantasy suite. Because we're still never got that, and I'm going to talk to that in just a minute. But anyway, wouldn't that have been on point? All right. Next up, we have Brooklyn. She gets also a second one-on-one. And I'm thinking to myself, really? A second one-on-one? Okay. But Zach does seem to be struggling with this a little bit. And so I wondered if he just needed one more date with her. But the date, and we know the sincerity and the importance of these because this means a hometown date, Rose, that they did highlight the city. Loved that. They're on the hot air balloon. They're at the spa, in the big pool on that older couple. Super cute. But it's the evening portion of the date where Brooklyn has already told Zach that her father has not been involved in her life, but that her grandfather, who is her hero and who has raised her, that he would meet the grandpa, and how important this meeting would be. So somebody, if they're going to love her, they have to love the family, etc. Now, Zach takes a step away from the table, and I think, oh my gosh, we've seen this before. This reminded me of Ari, right? When he got up and he walked away and the women would get anxious. Who wouldn't, right? So there's a moment probably where Brooklyn's like, oh my gosh. But he does come back and he tells her the truth. And what I liked is that he did say,
who am I to be in that house?
Who am I? Now, I think this was in the outtake though. Who am I to be meeting this family? Good for you, Zach. Pay attention. This is important. She's saying, my family's everything. And so it's at this point where we recognize, I'm sure Zach already has his favorite, right? I'm guessing final 2 are going to be Gabby and Kaity. And he already knows that. But then the question is, who else do I put in the mix? Because if I've got to get 4 people, sometimes the people who are the most vulnerable, we exclude earlier. It's like the single dad or the single mom, because we don't want to get invested and hooked into this family and then have to speak to this family if we know we're going to turn them down. So I wanted to say to Brooklyn, don't take that personally. I've really enjoyed her personality. I think she just kind of tells it like it is. So best of luck to Brooklyn. I thought she handled herself quite well. Overall, Zach handles this breakup with Brooklyn better. He leaves Brooklyn with her self-esteem intact. He says to Brooklyn, you deserve someone to love you the way that you love them. I thought, again, good for Zach. He seemed a little bit more feeling, a little bit more caring in this breakup. Okay, let's take a breath. So at this point, as I mentioned in my preview, we're looking and scrutinizing Zach more than we usually do. Why is that? Because we don't have any other drama, right? We don't have a Shanae and Shrimp Gates and anything else. So much of the focus has been on Zach. And as I said last week, I think he's doing some things okay, but others, yes, we're seeing his limits and they're right up there. So in almost all of my videos up to this point, I've been referring to Zach as having an anxious attachment style. And it's not uncommon in the anxious style to have what we call anxious angry, meaning that you have difficulty trusting people. You tend to perhaps get over involved easily, but you can also flip into a dismissive style because sometimes it's just too much. And referring back to Zach's childhood, that's what I've deduced at this point. But here's another theory that I want to help you explore that I think actually brings this a little bit deeper. And it was one of my followers who said, Dr. Diane, hey, do you follow this book, The 5 Personality Patterns by Stephen Kessler, your guide to understanding yourself and others and developing emotional maturity, right? Last week I talked about emotional intelligence. And so I'm really enjoying this book. And in particular, I want to read something to you that I think describes Zach pretty well. Now remember, there's 5 different types. But he talks about how we all have a defensive posture. This is a survival technique that we have from our childhood. And as a result, we're going to have different patterns of how we are in our relationships. Now, the defensiveness is that usually you, in particular in Zach, that you want to have control during situations. And we are seeing that. But let me just read to you a couple of things. So on page 56, 57, they start with this chart, the 5 different types, and breaks down how else we would describe these types. Now, I think Zach, as I've mentioned, is the rigid type of these 5. There's a primary and a secondary. And I'll tell you why, because there's gifts like your strengths, and then there's things you need to work on. The gifts are order, form, structure, positive aspects, good achiever, high functioning. An example is Mitt Romney. Difficulty, though, with feeling self and trusting self. Developmental task, meaning that they have trouble feeling and expressing themselves. The wound is an interpersonal and spiritual wound, but the effect is that this person has a fear of their own inner experience and a fear of loss of control. So how they cope then is by becoming somewhat rigid and controlling. And doesn't that sound like Zach? Because we know when things are going well, the people he likes, he's a little bit warmer, more empathic. But when there's a lot of like rules, this idea that no drama, now a new rule, no sex in the fantasy suite. I feel like he's creating these rules to try to protect himself, to manage the chaos. And that's what the rigid person does. So I want to just highlight this. Again, no excuse for the behavior, and let's talk about where to go from there. But this is an important thing that I see happening that goes very well along with attachment theory. It's under stress when you act out these particular patterns, very similar to attachment theory. As I say, we're all in hot water, and it's when you're in hot water that things get worse. So what also clued me into this was when Zach was with Ariel, and Ariel's like, oh, my dad's going to be, calls me a sailor when I swear, and Zach's like,
I like if my mom watches the amount of times I cuss, I'm she'd be like, oh, Zach.
and I get the feeling that, again, there is like the focus on presentation. That's what the rigid person does. They care very much about their appearances, how things look, whether Zach says he cares about Instagram followers or not. And that's the piece that I want to focus on. This part of Zach that somehow people say he feels older than he is. He feels like he says he's goofy, but we don't see the goofiness. So to me, there is that kind of rigidity. And that's when it pulls together everything for me. And I start to see Zach in a different way. Okay, now I talked about the primary types. There's usually a secondary type. And of the 5 types, the patterns are, as I said, rigid. Then there's the leaving type, the person who like just escapes, gets the heck out of there. The merging person, like a neediness, kind of too much merging. There's the endurance person, the person who like sticks around for too long. And then there's the aggressive type. And I think Zach also has a little bit secondarily this aggressive type. So I can't do this book justice. I encourage you to read it. But let me just read here. Patterned emotional life. Anxiety. The strong need of rigid partnered people to always be correct and to always do the right thing. Means they live in constant fear of making a mistake. This creates a constant tension within them, a tension which they feel as a general sense of anxiety and sometimes even as panic. And you kind of see that. You kind of see that happening in Zach, where like he's right before he makes a decision, he gets kind of like tight-lipped. And it's sort of like you feel this struggle, like he wants to express himself. With Jesse, he got a little bit more emotional. But in front of the women, you know, we've seen other bachelorettes. I can think of Tasha in particular. She kept saying, oh, this is hard. And like, you could just relate to it. This is hard. But we don't see that from Zach. We're not hearing a lot of the women professing their love. And so I worried again, does that create more insecurity? And where is Zach really? Okay. So now, where do we go with this? So if we all agree, yes, let me know in the comments if you think so. Okay, so there's some rigidness. And remember, no one is perfect, right? I can see myself that I might merge with a partner too much. We all have our imperfections. But what would Zach need to do to work through this? Because this is just information. Information is power. Recognizing that I'm getting defensive, I'm being somewhat rigid. What would be the antithesis of that? Flexibility. Being more flexible, allowing people to have their emotions, holding space. And we're hopefully going to see this at the Women Tell All, because I'm guessing, again, these women are coming at him like, you blindsided me. I'm guessing that's going to be Jess. That's going to be Kat. That they were getting mixed messages from him, and now they feel that they couldn't quite figure out what the heck happened. If he can lean into it, and I saw one little clip that he did say, I had no idea what was happening with Kat behind the scenes, rightfully so. They wouldn't show him. And then he said, I did some of these women wrong. And I think he meant Greer too. So if he can lean into that, being more flexible, if he can lean in and have some self-awareness and own his stuff, then that to me will give a positive indicator of how he's going to do in his relationship. Because at the end of the day, I really want Zach to find love too. And we all are workable, as I've said. You might be relating to this going, well, I have some of that rigidity too. People have told me I'm defensive. But then what do you do about it? Okay. He needs to, again, relax into his relationships. I'm going to guess that Kaity would be a really lovely match for him because she's playful. And Gabby is also, but I feel like Gabby is actually more sensitive. She talked about her own insecurities, and two insecure people might just be too much. But let me end it with a couple things, because we know that Kat went home. That was sad. And I loved that moment when the women came together. I love you. Despite the conflict, I always love the female relationships. I love the bromances that happen, and the support that they give to one another in this stressful situation to me is chef's kiss. Okay, so, but that video of Kaity and Gabby at the end with the bubbles and they're dancing in the hot tub spinning around, I just thought was precious. So loved, loved, loved that. I'm so looking forward to next week. And again, I'm hopeful that Zach can be more flexible on the Women Tell All and just help these women kind of put this to rest, because being on the show, let's face it, is very confusing. So on the tell-all, another thing that's really important to keep in mind, and it's usually a clue, if Zach has found love, he's actually going to be more understanding because he's happy now. But if he hasn't, that's when sometimes people get defensive about their journey because it hasn't all turned out right. I think we saw this a little bit in Clayton because we never saw the ending where he was like down on his knee, and so we all knew that, and that was pretty painful. And then the final rose is also difficult. But I don't think that's happened, and so that's why I am hopeful about what we see in terms of growth for Zach. All right, let's land this. The reality check. Look in the mirror. We're all on a journey to find love, right? And I want you to look a little bit deeper into your own patterns and your own behaviors. I'll look more deeply into the types of things that I do given what happened to me. Just look at that chart. But I think these are all helpful resources. If you want to better yourself in your relationships, whether you're single or partnered, we have to recognize that we all have defense mechanisms. These are things that actually kind of protect us, but that sometimes we can bump up against them as well. And it's going to help us to dive in a little bit more, to be more vulnerable, to speak our truth, to tolerate partners' feelings, and then to communicate in the best way possible. So I hope you enjoy this reference. I also think Attached is another wonderful book, and I'm going to leave you with that today. So let me know in the comments what you think about the 5 personality patterns. Do you agree with me that you think Zach has kind of more of a rigid style? And also, who you see Zach with? Who do you think who would be the best partner for him? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next week.